and friends. My favorite people came back. So this is going to be the SIG PM deep dive. So a bunch of you were here for the intro yesterday. To start, my name is Stephen Augustus. I work at VMware, and
hello, I'm Lockie Evenson. I work at Microsoft.
So a little bit more about us. We decided to put up pretty pictures. Sure. Wait for it. So to go a little deeper, I'm a senior cloud native architect at VMware. So that means I do pre and post sales delivery for customers, as well as do a lot of community focused work. So in addition to that, I'm the SIG chair for SIG PM, for SIG Release, and SIG Azure. I'm also on the KubeCon program committee. So.
And I'm a program manager at Microsoft on upstream projects. So helping with upstream endeavors like Kubernetes is one of the things that I do. And I represent Kubernetes in SIG PM. And I'm also a release team shadow for 1.15. So if you're interested in what's coming in 1.15, feel free to ask me afterwards. I'm also a CNCF ambassador, so you might see me around the place doing ambassadory things.
So this is going to be like, there's some rehash of what we talked about yesterday, and then we wanted to expand on one of the sub-projects in particular. So to start, like, what is SIG PM? Who is SIG PM? We are SIG PM. So Lockie is pretty intently focused on SIG PM, but the top-level chairs for SIG PM are Caleb Miles, who's at Pivotal, Ihor Dvoretskyi, who's at the CNCF as a developer ambassador, Jay Singer-Dumars, who is a program manager at Google, and myself. You already know me now, right? So what we're geared towards is defining and making sure that we're stewarding the process around product, program, and project management within the Kubernetes ecosystem. So you want to talk a little bit about this?
Yeah, I think, I've been in the Kubernetes community for a while, and one of the things that doesn't transcend so well into open source is kind of the product project, the P-star. So this is an endeavor under Kubernetes to try and bring all the work that we typically do inside corporate entities out into open source so that we can have great experiences around building products and projects and growing the community around that. So that's why I'm really excited to come. This is what I do for a day job at Microsoft, so to bring that tool out into the open source community and give back in that regard.
So I think it's really curious because like this is something that I don't think looking at a few open source projects, I don't think this exists, right? So trying to bring I think we're trying to and we're not reinventing a wheel that exists in commercial, but we're trying to invent a wheel, period, and hopefully create a set of process and procedure that can be used for hopefully different open source projects as well.
And totally, if you're interested in that and that kind of tickles your fancy as well, we would love to have you come and join SIG PM as well and lend your talents and skills, because we are trying to solve many problems in the project and help lend a hand as well.
Yeah. So yesterday we talked about the different sub-projects that we're spinning up in SIG PM. So we're just going to quickly go over that stuff again. I'm not going to dive into any of the projects in specific outside of KEPs. I think KEPs are like I mentioned, KEPs are in the critical path for everything that's being introduced into Kubernetes. So I think it's really important that everyone have an understanding of what KEPs do day to day. So again, our sub-projects are the sub-projects that we will be forming right after KubeCon, right after we draft our charter and all that good stuff. Will be KEPs, project management, CNCF end-user community interactions, and then external communications.
Has anybody ever raised a KEP in this room? Heard of a KEP? Okay, what's a KEP do?
Well, it's like a PEP, except for Kubernetes.
It's like a PEP, but for Kubernetes. Pretty accurate, right? So if you're trying to get an enhancement, some may call it a feature, into Kubernetes, this is the process that we ask the community to go through, and it serves many different arms. Do you want to go through?
Yeah. So the KEP is meant for multiple personas, the end users, the developers. The whole idea with KEPs, they're inspired by PEPs, they're inspired by Rust RFCs. What I would really like out of the process is that anyone who reads a KEP can at a glance understand what an enhancement is, right? And so from the perspective of the media, of developers who may not be familiar with that particular piece of code, this is supposed to give them an opportunity to just kind of have a one-sheet understanding of what that code is going to be introducing, or that new process it's going to be introducing to the project. So hopefully we can use this to eventually elicit product themes, right? So we essentially have a set of different product teams across Kubernetes, and we happen to call them SIGs, but they're if we want to draw those parallels between enterprise and not enterprise but commercial entities and open source, the way we organize, we have a set of committees, and committees are, our top level committee is the steering committee. The steering committee delegates authority from the committee itself to SIGs, which are special interest groups, right? There are also working groups and subprojects. Subprojects live inside of SIGs. Subprojects are the means of organization that actually owns code, right? So any piece of code that you've touched in Kubernetes or you've seen in Kubernetes probably belongs to some subproject within these 31, 32 SIGs that exist right now, right? And then finally, there are working groups, and working groups are cross-cutting efforts that are basically multiple SIG efforts, right? And the whole idea there is that there's supposed to be a finite amount of time that those working groups exist for, right? Define what the purpose of it is, right? So like the working group, the K8s infra team right now, right? The whole idea behind the K8s infra team is that we want to spin up a set of engineers and develop a set of processes that we can essentially migrate the Kubernetes build infrastructure that lives in Google right now over to CNCF-based infrastructure. So there are a bunch of different ways that we organize. The primary one that we focus on day to day is SIGs, and SIGs feel like product teams to me, right? So at the point that we get KEPs in a consistent manner, and we get KEPs on time, and well designed, gives us an opportunity to actually understand the themes that SIGs have in mind when they release code. So.
Keep going.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. So real quick, the way a KEP is designed, we talked about KEPs yesterday, and I wanted to do a more of a deeper dive into what a KEP is. How to spot a KEP, how to spot a good KEP, how to spot a bad KEP. So primarily, what we wanted to do is create a document that would be able that would lend itself to automation, right? So the first thing that we need to do there is create some sort of machine readable piece of that document, right? So that's the metadata section. And then, going a little deeper into the KEP, we've got the motivation, the summary, and these artifacts that are produced, right? Whether they're pictures or diagrams or something that are attached to the KEP. It's kind of, the artifacts that you would need to tie this story together, right? So the motivation and summary kind of obvious. It's why do we even want this enhancement, right? What's the goal behind this? How can we describe the goals, the non-goals of this enhancement? So.
Yeah, and I think it's important to call out, you don't see source code in a KEP, right? So we don't have a box up there for the code. So it's really about being human readable and describing the intent. So the what, the why, and not where you put the code. So when we think about personas, one of the teams is the release team, who are trying to understand and say, what is in release 1.15? And their source of record is actually all the KEPs. We're going to go through the process in the scope of the release team. They're looking at all the titles, they're looking at the summaries, they're looking at the motivation, so that when they cut a release in Kubernetes, they can actually say, this is what was delivered, because the person who is writing the feature is not the person typically who's part of the release team. So it's supposed to be that human readable artifact as to what and why, but not the code itself.
So just to be contrary to Locke.
You can be contrary to me. Hold me accountable.
So occasionally you will see code in KEPs, but Locke is right that it is meant to be as human readable as possible. So the mock for a feature you might see, right? I would like to do foo, and foo will speak to bar, and and then bar eventually speaks to baz. Like just getting the general idea of what the code flow looks like, you may see that, but often it will be strictly the human readable aspects of it.
Yeah, and I think it's just to add on to what Stephen's saying there. So you don't have to have the code written in order to raise the cap, right? So you can raise the cap. Yes, we have a question. I encourage dialogue. Thank you.
Hold on, we want to make sure
get
that's on video. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. My question is like when I am writing the cap, I am allowed to write some architectural diagrams.
So absolutely. So I think that that being able to provide documentation, and documentation is not just strictly words. Documentation is pictures, it's diagrams, it's whatever that you can provide to create that story behind it. So yes, absolutely. So what we want to do now is we're actually going to show you a cap. I think that's the next slide. Yeah. All right. Hold on. So this is the first part of this is the metadata field that we were talking about, and this is the first part of the KEP. It's kind of laying out what the title of the KEP is, the authors of the KEP, the owning SIGs, who's participating in that, the reviewers, approvers, when it was created, when it was last updated, so on and so forth. Right. So this. You can a machine can read this, a human can read this fairly easily, right? So even from the top level of a KEP, you get a quick idea of like who I need to contact if I need more information about this, right? So we mentioned the status here, and I like to hammer in the note that these statuses are important because these statuses give us a signal behind which we understand the level of work that needs to be done on that KEP for it to be accepted, right? So a provisional KEP is, hey, I have a really great idea. I think it's a great idea. Can I write a little bit about this and have the SIG review it? And maybe if that makes sense, I can do a prototype on this idea and move it forward, right? And at that point, the SIG is supposed to say, hey, okay, this motivation looks good. Some of these goals look good. We should make some of these non-goals. The implementations may be a little off, or maybe you haven't written the implementation or don't have a test planner. That's okay, right? As it moves into the implementable state, the bar for this gets a lot higher, right? The implementable state is kind of the bar at which the release team says, it's either going in the release or it's not, right? If it's going in the release, it needs to have some sense of implementation, like how we're actually going to do the implementation, what the non-goals of that feature are, what the test plan is. And we've actually updated the KEP template recently to include a release team checklist, right? So these are the things that the release team will commonly ask for. And we're going to go to the repo at some point and actually show you more of this KEP to get a better idea of how we structure this.
Yeah, so don't worry about remembering all those fields if you're busily writing them down. They're in a template. I think it's, who can tell me what this KEP is going to do in Kubernetes? Anybody?
Scream it out.
Right, so I think the good thing is in a title, without even a summary or abstract, you can actually say what this thing is going to do. So that's incredibly clear for somebody like me or somebody on the release team and come and say, okay, that's a feature that we're shipping. That can be a top-level item that ends up on the blog. We wrote a nice blog about it, and then the community can use it. So not having this process in place means we don't have any way to track what's going into Kubernetes at the velocity, and therefore we don't know what to tell people in the community who are using Kubernetes about what features are there, what state are they in, and how to use them.
So moving forward, the way that we try to tie KEPs together is including an enhancement issue, right? So we're kind of in this split state where we are using enhancement issues And I'm sorry if the font is a little small, but these are kind of just like snapshots from the repo. So this is, when you open an enhancement issue, you're given an issue template, and the issue template is like, hey, describe your KEP. Tell me a little, describe your enhancement. Tell me a little bit about how it works. You'll see a link to that proposal, as well as like who I need to contact, right? So because this is so we have a directory of KEPs, right? And we have multiple subdirectories per SIG of KEPs. So this is an easier ingress point for the release team to just at a glance see what's going on, who I need to contact for more details. And if you were to look through one of these issues, you would just see multiple pings from the release team like, hey, are your docs ready? Hey, this it's code freeze in a week. Please make sure that blah, blah, blah is done. This is kind of like this has been our steel thread behind how the enhancement's built, and we want to shift away from that. Like this is one of my annoying pings that I think this is the release I figured out how to automate that. So this is like the previous template, just giving you a rundown. Yeah, this is 112. Giving you a rundown like, hey, do we expect anything to happen with this feature this time around? And if so, these are all the things that I need. As you can see that there is a set of labels attached to these, right? The kind feature, SIG storage, stage beta, and tracked yes, right? So the release team uses that tracked yes as an indicator that this is something that's going into the release. And the rest of them are common indicators that you'll see across Kubernetes repos.
You can also see on the right-hand side in the milestone, because it is tracked, right here you can actually see this is due to land in 115, and if you can see this over here, they also have identified that the beta release target is 115. So if you were to go into the enhancement issues repo and click on the 115 milestone today, you would see all the enhancements that are proposed for the 115 release.
So we're going to go to the repo really quick. All right, so first, to give you an example of what well, not an example, but the canonical template for KEPs, right? And, this template is kind of a cross between a template and instructions, right? We figured it's easier to have the documentation in one place instead of jumping between two markdown files, because everyone loves reading markdown. So essentially, we want you to pick a hosting SIG. We want you to make a copy of the template. Now, picking a hosting SIG means that you have some sort of reference point of who is supposed to actually own this, right? And I think that this part is really important because, especially for newer contributors, right? Starting to work on enhancements without a plan is exactly, and without clear SIG ownership is exactly how they get hung up, right? So being able to understand who owns it or who should own it, or being able to ask the right questions to figure that out is one of the most important first steps.
Yeah, especially because people come and go in the community, but the SIG is the entity that should remain. And obviously as features come in, that SIG maintains responsibility over the lifetime of that feature as it goes into alpha, beta, stable, or even if it's plucked out. If it only goes into alpha, they get to make the decision to pull it back out if it's not getting any momentum as well. So it's important to go in and verbalize it with this SIG as well, because basically you need the sponsorship of the SIG to take on that enhancement, right, for the lifetime of the enhancement. Even though you're trying to get, or your team's trying to get one enhancement in, you got to think about the longevity of that enhancement over time. And that's why SIGs are important.
And and the second thing I'd like to point out is the whole idea of merge early, iterate often, right? I'm big on the differences between these two states, or these primary two states of KEPs, the provisional state and the implementable state, is that the bar is much lower, or the bar is supposed to be much lower. Yet there are several open PRs for KEPs that have been open since January, December, November for provisional KEPs that are not merged yet, because there's kind of like a bike shedding process. They're like, hey, well, if you could do this, or well, if this API did blah. It's like, hold on, is it a good idea or not? Right? Let's get that merged in, and then let's talk about it. I think it's easier to have that discussion once the idea is brought forth in a SIG meeting or in a design document, and then bring that into the KEP, right? So for everyone who's going to listen to this recording later, merge early, iterate often, please, please. So the KEP has a pretty table of contents, as you do. This release sign-off checklist that I was talking about, right? So do I have an enhancement in the release milestone? Have I created an enhancement issue, right? Have KEP approvers set the status to implementable, right? So this is like, okay, the bar is higher. Have we iterated over the design details? Have we done a test plan? Do we understand what the graduation criteria for this enhancement is? Have we made sure that we've committed to history what the implementation steps have been, right? Do we have user-facing documentation, right? Because this isn't useful unless users can actually use it, right? So it's great to look at this proposal, but unless people understand how to use it, guess what? They're not going to. So.
And if you were to guess, who would you think the KEP approvers are?
Scream it out!
Go for it. Yeah, go for it.
Right.
Absolutely. So they're designated per SIG of whatever SIG that you designated, the owner of that feature or whoever's taking it on. So they will have KEP approvers per SIG.
So as an example, we can click through the repo, hoping Wi-Fi is all happy. So you can see there's two files, the owners and the owner's alias file, right? So this repo in particular, because it's under SIG PM, you'll see approvers are set as the PM maintainers, the PM leads, and then the reviewers are like feature maintainers. There are a bunch of different historical reasons why there are so many aliases. But the process owners, the process approvers, and SIG release leads are allowed to look at this stuff. And then these labels here mean that anything that's labeled as, anything that comes into this repo as a code change will get automatically labeled as SIG PM, which means now it's searchable across the Kubernetes repos, right? And then, within the owner's aliases, because owners by itself is not super useful, but the owner's aliases will give you a rundown of these are the API machinery leads, these are the API, the SIG app leads, so on and so forth. These people are the people who are ultimately going to approve things that are landing in this repo, right? And then we have custom content down here, which defines the PM maintainers and so on and so forth. And you can see that Lockie and I are on this list, and it's essentially SIG PM plus SIG release looking at this list, and SIG architecture. No, forget about them. But going back to the template. So some of these sections that we talked about, right? And really it is incredibly human readable, and I think writing a KEP should be easy. It should be painless. There has been some friction before, especially in the the 1.14 release cycle. We introduced KEPs as a requirement for the release cycle. So we said, okay, well, things are just kind of flying in. We need to make sure that there's some gate, right? To stop writing code for a second and really elucidate the ideas that you have, and then moving into it. You want to?
Yeah, absolutely. Goals and non-goals. I feel like we get in the summary and the motivation. That's the first hurdle, and you will hash out the goals and non-goals of them. And that's really just being crystal clear on what the purpose of this is and what the purpose of it is not. So, but. We also call out things that are optional. I think from here on down they're optional for
Yes.
As marked by.
But you can see, we start to ask some harder questions, right? So what are the constraints behind, doing certain implementations, right? Is it a human bandwidth constraint? And going back to the owner's files, right? The top level approvers who are commonly SIG chairs and SIG technical leads, everything flows through their queue unless they have help, right? So it's very important to understand, yes, we have human constraints. We may have infrastructure constraints, right? We may not be able to build certain things, like recreating the release process because we don't have revenue for it, right? Or it could be we can't implement this API because this is this contradicts this other API that you never knew about, but we can't deprecate yet because our deprecation cycle is at least 2 cycles, right? Yeah. So there are a bunch of idiosyncrasies to the process that you have to be aware of, but starting to list this stuff for a reviewer gives them the context to start doing the research for you, right? And then, finally the test plan, graduation criteria, and upgrade, downgrade strategy, version SKU strategy, and finally like listing. These are some of the optional fields that Lockie had mentioned. So we said we were going to stay in the repo, and we are going to stay in the repo for a little bit, just to look at. So this is the CSI volume resizing KEP or tracking issue that we had shown in the slides, and just running through really quickly, you can see like it doesn't take a lot to get this done, right? Or as I scroll to infinity.
No.
But you see the summary is short, the motivations are pretty brief, and the goals and non-goals, like it doesn't take a lot to like understand the baseline of what the motivation of an enhancement is. So like I don't think it's a high bar to ask people for. But going into this proposal, waka, right? It defines all of the APIs that it would be hitting, considerations around what's changing in the kubelet, and then starting to talk about the secrets for PVCs. And as I was mentioning, you can see that this is this is code like. Right, but this is not the full implementation of it. But it gives you enough of an idea, like, oh, we're going to introduce these new types, and it doesn't need to necessarily define the spec of the types, but at least give you an idea of what the type is going to be. Right?
Yep. And from there we go down into the test plan. Now this becomes more critical as you kind of crystallize what you're going to do in the CAP, and this outlines when we're doing the release what we need to look at to make sure that this enhancement is in the right process. And graduation criteria, sorry, I've got losing my voice. What is the milestones you want to hit for alpha, beta, and GA, and how to get through them? So this is a great example of how to write a CAP. So if you're looking at a CAP, or you want to write your own or review somebody else's, this is a great one to look at to see the fields that you need to think about. And you'll see up the top there, we're under Kubernetes enhancements. And you can see KEP SIG storage, and there's the KEP name. So they've taken that template that Stephen's shown and actually just filled it in there.
So now I want to talk a little bit about, I think we have not too many minutes left, but I'm going to speed through this. So this is kind of like the future state, it's like in a world where KEPs evolve. So we want to move to the point where, we've already started to tie KEPs to the release process, and we want to move that forward even further, right? So in the SIG release repo, we organize by releases, right? So the release /115 subdirectory will describe the release team, the dates, the important dates for that release, the exceptions that are attached to that release. So exceptions are when something doesn't get in time. It doesn't have all of the things that it needed in time, and we're like, hey, you got to file a thing for us, and we have to approve it so that we can make sure this is safe to introduce to Kubernetes at this later stage, right? So we want to try to move to a point where we can do the same within the enhancements repo, and then kind of like cover this and layer it in automation, right? So the idea is that we would go into these enhancement states and essentially create a receipt, right? And that receipt is very similar to that enhancement issue that you saw before, right? But the big difference here is that the receipt becomes a PR, right? So now we're committing this to the history of Kubernetes, right? So it's not like, yes, it's fairly easy to, it's fairly easy to look up an enhancement issue, and yes, it's entirely possible that it doesn't matter because we will continue to use GitHub forever, but it's possible that we'll switch off of GitHub, right? And having something that is version controlled, super important, right? Having that receipt in the repo means that we can take the release team and have them as approvers for these things that are coming into the release, right? They approve it. Once they approve it, a bot comes along and transfers all of the information from proposed KEPs or proposed enhancements over to accepted, right? And then from there we can move it through states. And what changes there is the human nagging of like, hey, it's 5 days until this thing is done. Like, can you please like fill these things out? Becomes our bot runs at this day, 6 p.m. Pacific time, right? If your thing is not in by then, it doesn't get in, right? It's automatically subject to the enhancements, the exceptions process, right? So starting to layer automation around this area, or yes, that okay, means that we can start to keep all of these things in a single place, and also leverage the existing CI/CD pipelines that we have in place for Kubernetes. So. And I think that's about it, right? So if you're interested in getting involved.
Yeah, do you feel prepared to write your first KEP now? There are easy entry points in the community to deal with KEPs. Release team is one of them. SIG PM is one of them as well. Obviously, this is all public, so you can go and take a look at your own leisure. But I think it's important to understand the process if you're responsible for getting enhancements into Kubernetes or leading a team as to how you might do that. Because quite often we see new teams show up, they want to do some great work, and the process gets in the way because they don't understand the process. So we're putting a lot of effort into education around the process so that we can give you a smooth transition. And a lot of this, as Stephen said, is around tracking how things enter the project, so we can go back and see how decisions were made and who made those decisions, so that we just have a tracking process. Because this, in the early days of Kubernetes, we didn't have a tracking mechanism.
It was a spreadsheet.
Yeah,
it actually is still a spreadsheet.
It's still a spreadsheet, but there is stuff in GitHub now.
Yes.
So that's not just code.
Do we have the, hold on, actually, to give you an idea of how mind-boggling this can be for the release team.
So so the release team, did you want to pull the enhancements?
Yeah, I'm going to track that down. Oop, wrong one. Release.
So there is a role within the enhancements team called the, in the release team called the enhancements team. So there's an enhancements lead and n number of shadows for each release. And in there,
right, so this is the Kubernetes 115 enhancement tracking spreadsheet, right? And I will tell you, as someone who has previously done this role, and I think, Lockie, you've also shadowed this role, this is a manual process. There is a team of people who have put this into a spreadsheet, and they do so every release cycle, right? This is not something that's sustainable. I don't think it's something that's sustainable or can be ensured to be accurate all the time. Right, so you can see we keep the features list here. We keep a list of things that we have, that SIGs have either deferred or removed, or we've forcibly removed from the milestones. We have like a little stats tracking to understand, like, hey, well, these are the kind of alpha features are in. So we can kind of get an idea of, like, if this is going to be a release that is heavily weighted on new features altogether, if it's going to be something that is kind of like a stability release. So like this is kind of the reason that we put these together. But again, this is not sustainable if it's done by just people. Like, it's prone to error, right? And I had to click way too many buttons to get to that. So. So that said, we have 2 minutes left. I think we have time for a few questions if anyone's interested.
What issues or pushback have you seen with implementing KEPs so far?
So I think the biggest one is the fact that, as Lockie was mentioning, there has been a lack of process or lack of consistent process across the community. And this is, I mean, because this is in the critical path for people on the release team, for people consuming the project overall, it has been like, whoa, process. We haven't seen real process like this before. So I think it's lightweight, but we're still trying to work out if it's lightweight enough for people and easy to use. It has to be super easy to use for it to be successful.
Any other questions? Yes.
I really got alarmed when I saw all the manual job that you had to do on the Excel sheet. And my question is, if you are a very well-known open source project, haven't you got at least some free license from Jira to help you track features? Because Jira out of the box does all these things you show on the spreadsheet.
So that's fair, and so what we try to do is use the tools that we know everyone can get at, right? Regardless of whether or not you have a free license of Jira, there is an understanding, and there is also a maintenance overhead for. I know every company that I've been at where that they've spun up Jira, they've gone like, hey, can you help out with building out the Jira workflows and the boards and help us burn down this thing? And I'm like, hey, I'm an SRE. This is not my job, right? So it's, dedicating ourselves to picking up Jira means that we have to create a support team for that, right? And overall, our community is not in the, I think we're all here to support each other, but we're not in the business of building support teams for free software, right?
Any other questions? Alrighty. Thank you very much for joining.
Thank you so much.